Martin Jacques argues that in the past 2 centuries, Western ideas and culture drove our understanding of what was modern, and that the 21st century will be driven by Asian influences. Harvard University hosts this Our 20-Minute event.
To understand the significance of the rise of China, I think perhaps it ought to be set in a broader context, which is the rise of the developing world more generally. Around about 1973, the developing world accounted for roughly a third of global GDP, and today it's something around 50-50. And according to the kind of projections produced by Goldman Sachs, this picture will steadily change along those lines to a point where, for example, I mean, this is obviously a distant historic projection, but in 2050, Chinese economy would be twice the size of the American economy, the Indian economy would be the same size as the American economy, and the next economies up would be countries like Mexico and Brazil and Russia and Indonesia. In other words, a very, very different world from the European and then Western world that we've grown up in the last 200 years. Now, obviously, this represents an extraordinary shift in the economic center of gravity. The question is, to what extent does it represent something more than that? Now, historically, modernity was more or less synonymous with Western modernity. The only exception was Japan, the only country to industrialize outside the West during the course of the 19th century. And the assumption was basically for a long time that the process of modernization was a process of westernization. Actually, if we'd taken Japan seriously enough, we would have seen that this was fallacious, because Japanese modernity has never looked like Western modernity. Obviously, like all modernities, it had to draw and learn from the West, but it developed a hybrid phenomenon, which in many respects looked profoundly different from what we were familiar with Western modernity. And if this is true of Japan, it certainly will be true of China. Highly distinct history, culture, and of course an additional factor which will mean that China will exercise a profound influence on the world, namely its sheer size means that it will have an extraordinary gravitational influence on the rest of the world. Now, what I want to spend the few minutes doing in the course of opening the seminar is to look at 4 characteristics of China which mark it out as very distinct from the Western experience, and in my view will also profoundly shape the nature of Chinese modernity in a very distinctive fashion. And as China becomes an increasingly important global power, and probably ultimately the leading global power, then these characteristics will come to also have a profound impact on the world more widely. Now, the first point I want to make, probably the most important for me, is that although China for 100 years has described itself as a nation-state and adopted the protocol, norms and institutions of a nation-state, it's not really a nation-state. It's, or at least I like to think of China as the topsoil is that of a nation-state, but the geological structure of China is that of a civilization state. Now, what do I mean by this, or how can I call it? Why do I call it a civilization state? Well, as you know, very unusually, or uniquely, really, especially for such a large country, China has existed for a lot longer than 100 years. It's, I mean, if you take it back to the victory of the Qin at the end of the Warring State period, you're well over 2 millennium. And by then, China had begun to assume in the eastern part of China the western part of China being much later as a result of the Qing dynasty's conquests and so on, in the eastern part of China. Already the Qin boundaries are beginning to assume the character of the borders of China today. And if you look at the Han dynasty, which immediately succeeded it, then it's very clear that that is the case. And so China is at least, 2,000 years. Of course, the Chinese call themselves 5,000 years old, but at least 2,000 years old, the oldest continuously existing polity in the world. And what is so interesting about this, I think, is that all the characteristics which defined the Chinese as Chinese, which give the Chinese a sense of identity, come from the civilization state period, not from this very recent nation state period. Ideographic language, Confucian values, very distinctive character of the family, a very markedly different notion of the relationship between state and society. A lot of the Chinese customs like ancestral worship and so on come from this period. Unlike the tradition in the West, where essentially the sense of identity comes from the nation-state period. So this far history, I think, is extremely important in understanding China as a civilization state. The other dimension is the sheer scale, both demographic and physical, of China, and the diversity that comes from that. I mean, historically, I think, or contemporarily, we underestimate the diversity of China, probably for political reasons. And there are huge systemic variations across China, as well as enormous disparities between the provinces in terms of income per head, socioeconomic structure, and so on. Now, what does it mean in practice to be a civilization state? How does it affect behavior? Well, there's two things I want to say. There's lots of things we're going to say, but two examples. The first example is that actually the overriding political priority in the governance of China in the imperial period and in the communist period has been the problem of unity, the question of unity. This is the most important question, and this defines it. But the whole way the political dynamic works, it therefore distinguishes it from a Western tradition in this sense. And the reason why is because China's grown up with these enormous civilization extent, and this sense of history. But also, it's extremely difficult to keep together. And for Wang Gungwu estimates that for the 2,000 years since the Qin, roughly half that time, China's been in various degrees of disunity and instability and so on, and generally coinciding with the worst periods of Chinese history. So, firstly, unity is very important. If you want to know why I think Mao Zedong is still so popular in China to this day, Mao's greatest achievement, bar none, was that he put the country together again in 1949. He restored the country's sovereignty, and he also constructed an efficacious state, which has always been very important at the heart of China once more. So, firstly, unity. And this is so different from Europe as to be extraordinary. I mean, the main difference between Europe and China is nothing to do with timing of industrialization, important as that is, or forms of governance and so, types of political system and so on. The fundamental difference was China unified, Europe divided, almost very similar historical period. Steady state, equilibrium position of Europe, nation state, division into nation states, equilibrium position of China is a civilization state. But the other point, in a way, the second example I want to give of this is more interesting, I think. And we didn't think of it in these terms at the time. But you remember in 1997 the handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China. And the Chinese constitutional proposal was one country, two systems, and I doubt whether anyone, or very, very few people, took the Chinese seriously. I think they probably thought, oh, it's a bit of window dressing, and once the handover takes place, Hong Kong will be the same as it will be incorporated on the terms of the PRC, whatever exactly those were. Actually, this was utterly mistaken. I mean, we're 12 years on from the handover, and the political and legal system of Hong Kong is as different now in fundamental respects as it was then. In other words, actually, when the Chinese proposed one country, two systems, they were completely serious about it. So why didn't we understand? Why didn't we see it like that? Why didn't we take them seriously? Well, I think the reason we didn't take them seriously is because it was a completely alien way of thinking to a Western mindset which is used to handling nation states. So, for example, when Germany, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, implosion of East Germany, reunification of Germany, was totally and exclusively on the terms of the Federal Republic. One nation, one system. This is classic nation-state thinking. One nation, state, one system. Whereas for the civilization state mentality, one country, two systems is not alien, because to hold China together with so many disparities, so many differences, and so on, it's actually had to incorporate, to a much greater extent, forms of systemic variation within its size. And for example, when Taiwan becomes part of China, which I think we can now see on the horizon, or just beyond the horizon, this will happen, and accept Chinese sovereignty, we can guess already what the terms of that offer will be, which I think will be one country, two systems, or one country, another system. In the case of Taiwan, I should imagine they will be allowed to keep their armed forces. They'll be given representation in the international organizations up to a point, as the Chinese have already agreed that Taiwan should have observer status at the WHO. So now I could carry on with this point, and I will briefly return to it in the context of two other questions, because we cannot understand the Chinese conception of race, or the notion of the Han Chinese, without some notion of the civilization state. Likewise, this extraordinary beast called the Chinese state, we cannot understand the Chinese state, it seems to me, and its place within society, its relationship to society, without the context of the civilization state. But before I come to that, I wanted to take up a second point, which is the tributary state system. Now, for a long time, at least 2,000, maybe 3,000 years, East Asia, by which I mean Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and Indochina plus China, were organized according to the tributary state system, which rested on the overwhelming dominance, economic and cultural, of China in the region, and which was accepted by these neighboring states. It was a flexible system. It worked differently for different countries. So, for example, territories, so Japan had a looser relationship with it than, for example, the Korean Peninsula. Basically, territories paid tribute to the emperor in return for access to the Chinese market and various forms of protection. And it broke at the end of the 19th century with the growing enfeeblement, well, first of all, the growing enfeeblement of the Chinese economy in the latter days of the Qing dynasty, and secondly, the arrival of European and Japanese colonialism. Now, it seems to me that we're now moving through into a new era in terms of the structure of East Asia, or the structure of the East Asian economy. The economy is being reconfigured, the regional economy, at an extremely rapid rate, and it's illustrated by the fact that China is very rapidly emerging as the most important destination for the exports of virtually every country in the region. In other words, it's the regional economy, for the first time since the tributary state system, is becoming once more China-centric. And if this process carries on at the kind of speed it's carrying on, and I think it probably will, then I think we're looking at what is in effect a new interstate system in East Asia. I mean, we basically had the Westphalian system since the end of colonization, but I think we'll be moving into a different sort of system, which I would suggest may well bear some of the characteristics or echoes of the tributary state system. I mean, as David Kang has argued, you know, if you've had something for 2,000 or 3,000 years, then the prevailing attitudes from that period don't just disappear. They're probably just been below the surface, and one can imagine them in some ways or other being restored. And this, of course, this is going to have profound political and cultural effects in the region. Well, it already is, actually. If you look at the region, there's attitudes have changed a great deal over the last 10 years, 15 years. And one example of this in the longer run might well be that Mandarin will become the lingua franca in the region, alongside English maybe, and time supplant English, depending on what happens to the global fortunes of English, or in particular in this region. But in schools in South Korea and Thailand, Mandarin is already a compulsory subject. And interestingly, because it's a little less predictable, Malaysian Ministry of Education in August announced that they were considering making Mandarin a compulsory language in Malaysian schools as well. So, and I think that, let me make a wider kind of conceptual suggestion, which is that if we, I mean, obviously East Asia is very historically specific. This was where the tributary state system existed. This was where, you know, this was the Chinese world order. This was the region where it was based. But should we think of China's evolving relations with Africa in these sorts of terms? Can we learn something from that experience for suggesting how the Chinese might behave in Africa? I mean, normally the reflex action, our Western reflex action, is to say the colonial relationship. But actually China's never had a colonial relationship. I mean, it never had any colonies, but it did have a tributary state system. So I think that one of the difficulties I would like one of the difficulties we have with understanding China, maybe more widely the developing world, is a too mechanical use of Western concepts to try and understand, for example, China, when in fact, by and large, the Western intellectual experience has not addressed these kind of questions. I mean, it's obviously addressed primarily the Western experience and history and reality and so on. But to understand China, we do need to generate, it seems to me, a different sort of conceptual apparatus alongside certain ideas that are, I think, applicable. And in this context, I say civilization state and the tributary state system are obviously very important. Now, a third point is, the third characteristic of China, a distinguishing characteristic, is about race. Often not discussed in polite society, actually because it's too important. I mean, everyone knows that China's got a huge population of 1.3 billion, but not everyone is familiar with the fact that over 90% of the Chinese think of themselves as of one race. Now, you might reply and say, well, obviously this is ridiculous because you know, it's obviously true that in eastern China, where the Han have been based historically, easily the most densely populated part of China, the Han are drawn from countless different races. But that's not really the point. Because we have to understand why the Chinese think of it like this, because after all, race is essentially a cultural construct and not a biological idea, a biological fact. Now, the other point I want to stress here is that China's experience, China's view in this context, this almost monoracial view with the ethnic minorities at the edges of the Chinese experience, is so different from the other most populous countries in the world. India, the United States, Indonesia, Brazil, all are palpably and recognize themselves to be very multiracial. China doesn't think like that. I mean, it claims that it's multiracial and so on, but it's actually overwhelmingly Han, and its mentality is Han, and the way it celebrates the ethnic minorities is in a sort of more like a folk tradition than anything else. So why do the Chinese think like this? Well, let me offer a couple of explanations, which, I mean, there's more, but there's two central ones, I think, which are both take us right back to the civilization state idea. There you have, in this same physical space, which is, again, I'm talking about the eastern half of China, a long period, I mean, forget the romantic way in which often in Chinese writing the process of Chinese unification took place. Over a long period of mixing, in the same physical space, countless races, mixing, mingling, melding, absorption, assimilation, often forced assimilation, widespread population movement. This is nothing new with this. The imperial regimes used population movement as a means of assimilation and forced absorption of provinces that were difficult. And of course, wars and so on. I mean, southern China was a long process of subjugation taking place, over a period of thousands of years. Anyway, the result of this process, because it was taking place over such a long time and within this, as it were, finite area, was the gradual closing down, if you like, or diminishing of a sense of differences between these races and the emergence of a sort of overarching identity which seemed to be more important than other identities, be they linguistic or regional or racial or what have you. And that was one process seemed to be taking place. And the other process that was taking place was, this long history of China, which is extraordinary, not because it's had a great civilizational period, but it's had several of them, And it was a relatively advanced civilization for very significant periods of the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. One of the first written languages, developed a very early literary tradition, ideographic language. It was developed some of the first state forms because, along with the Fertile Crescent at roughly the same time, or maybe slightly earlier, it was the first settler sedentary agriculture and so on. And so through particularly dynasties like the Tang and the Song and the early Ming, China was extraordinarily successful in regional terms, but also we know now in global terms. And this led to a very powerful sense of the emergence of a cultural identity amongst the Chinese. The most important, the calling card of China, in a way, the calling card of the Chinese is culture, a sense of their cultural identity and achievement. And if you want to know what Chinese global hegemony might look like, I would start personally with that, discussing that kind of question. So you have these two things working alongside each other, this long process of closing the distance, physical differences, etc., and the other is the success and the emergence of a strong sense of Chinese cultural awareness and identity. And I think that, above all, explains why so many, over 90%, regard themselves to be Han. Han is actually a new term, only came into being really in the late 19th century. Consequence, two consequences, one positive and one negative. The positive consequence, really, the process of the creation of modern China, every country has essentially an ethnic process of creation of some kind. The creation of modern China was the Hanization of China. The Hanization of China. And the consequence of the Hanization of China has been, I think, essential to the cohesion of China. That's why, essentially, it stuck together. That's why predictions of imminent breakup after 1989 were wrong and really, in historical context, ridiculous. China was not going to break up. It was not like the Soviet Union. Only half the Soviet Union was Russian. So that's the first point. But the second point also is that the Han have, in my view, in general, a weak conception of cultural difference, a weak respect for cultural difference. I mean, this is classically played out in the other half of China, the half conquered by the Qing from the 17th century onwards, which is populated by very different kinds of people, as illustrated by the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. And essentially, to this day, the problem with the relations between the Han and the Uyghurs and the Tibetans is a fundamental lack of respect for their cultural difference, their cultural rights, their language, their religion, and so on. And if one was looking for, I mean, normally people's fears about China in the West and the rise of China being expressed in terms of democracy, that's not my greatest concern. I'm not saying it is not an issue, it is, but my greatest concern would be in a world which is defined in a sense by cultural difference, how will the Han relate to the question of cultural difference? My fourth and last point, and then I'll shut up, Neil, is about the state, actually. And It seems to me that the Chinese state, the relationship between the Chinese state and Chinese society is very, very different from the relationship between a Western state and Western society. We haven't paid nearly enough attention to this question. We've been so absorbed by the question of an issue of democracy that we've thought that somehow all questions about governance are subsumed into that, and all understandings about authority are subsumed into this. And I think this is a mistake. And I want to make two main propositions about this. The first one might seem outlandish, but it seems to me that the Chinese state enjoys more authority, more legitimacy, more respect, even more deference amongst the Chinese than any Western state enjoys in their population, even though not a vote is ever cast. Not a vote is ever cast. And I think the reason for this lies in how the Chinese, over a very long historical period, see the state. They see the state as the guardian, the custodian, the embodiment of Chinese civilization. Back to the civilizational state point. That this is, the historic duty and obligation of the Chinese state is to protect and to maintain the unity of China. If it fails, the mandate of heaven is withdrawn. If this government fails in this respect, it won't last very long at all. It will be out, and this regime will be over. So again, to understand where legitimacy, it's not so different, not completely different actually in this context from the Japanese experience. I don't think that, although there's universal suffrage in Japan, I don't think there is popular sovereignty in the Western sense. I think that legitimacy in Japan essentially resides within the states, or another Confucian tradition. But this is much more true, and in a different way, in China. The second point, which again is very different from the Western experience, is that for roughly half the period since the Qin, last 1,000 years, the Chinese state has had no serious competitors to its authority. No serious competitors whatsoever. This is so unlike the Western tradition. European states had to fight tooth and nail to carve out their authority, firstly against the church and then subsequently against, depending on where, the nobility, the aristocracy, and so on. So it was a very complicated, long struggle to establish the legitimacy and area of authority of the state, which was codified in law over this long historic period. And this is still true to this day. The argument in America over the rights of the government to intervene in healthcare is a sort of latter-day illustration of this point. Now, China's never had this question. In fact, as a result, there are no clear boundaries to the authority of the Chinese state. And they are not codified in law. Now, if you take these 2 points together, which is the state in the civilizational state context, my first point, and my second point is no competitors, you can see that the whole construction historically of the Chinese state is very, very different from that of any Western state. And I think that to try and understand what's going to happen, or how the state behaves and how it's regarded and so on in China, these are sort of building blocks of trying to appreciate it. My final point in this context is just about, and this really is my last point, obviously a chuckle of disbelief. My last point is that the Chinese state is an extraordinarily competent state. Okay, it's a poor developing society. There's, of course, serious problems of corruption and so on. But this is a very, very old tradition of statecraft. I think China is really the home of statecraft. And it was no accident that Confucius, writing at roughly the same time as the Greek philosophers, was the first great theorist in a way of, the moral obligations of rulers and so on. If you look at the period since 1978, I mean, this has been the most remarkable economic transformation probably ever so far. And, you know, it's been conducted with extraordinary ability and skill by the Chinese government. Why? Well, I think it's because there's a very, very powerful tradition of state competence in China. It's not new to this period. It's been there for, you know, across many, many imperial dynasties and many great achievements, infrastructural achievements, and so on. The Chinese take the state and statecraft extremely seriously. And I think that one of the results of the rise of China will be a sort of growing interest in the idea of state competence, which has been invisible in the West, especially in the neoliberal period. But it's obviously got quite an appeal in the developing world. And with that, my 4 points, I finish.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Before I open this up to a general discussion, those questions, I'm going to abuse the chair's privilege and ask a couple of questions of my own. Martin, I suppose I'll believe China rules the world when a Chinese scholar gives a seminar paper on American decline at a Chinese university at which about a quarter of the audience are Americans. I mean, the very fact of your writing this book has something of a hegemonic quality to it in the old sense of Anglophone hegemony. It's clear that you buy the Goldman Sachs Jim O'Neill story that China's GDP is going to overtake that of the United States in 2027 at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 25th of December. But I wonder whether what you're telling us about China implies anything more than that. In other words, it's not clear that your civilization state, with its tradition of tributary relations with its neighbors, and yes, maybe some African countries today, has an aspiration to rule the world. Could you tell us if there is, in fact, some prospect of that? Because that doesn't seem to be in the tradition that you're describing. And therefore, why worry?
Well, I think you've put your finger on a very important distinction between the Chinese tradition and the Western tradition. I mean, they do share a characteristic, actually. They both are civilizations which have a strong sense of universalism, unlike Japan, for example, which didn't and never has. But the way that's expressed is very different. Whereas essentially the European tradition sought to project itself over time across the world, and I suppose the colonial tradition was the most dramatic illustration of this, the Chinese tradition hasn't been like that. I mean, by and large, except on the territory, as it were, of the Chinese continent, it's not tried to externalize itself, with the exception of the tributary state system. So the idea of projection has not really existed in the same sort of way as in the Western context. I mean, essentially the Chinese idea of their superiority was that, you know, that the center of the world was China, the land under heaven, as it was put, was China. And then the rest of the world existed in this is a crude oversimplification, but a set of concentric circles which became more and more living in the shadows, defining different degrees of barbarism. And there at the center of the world was China. And so, I mean, the attitude, for example, to Chinese people who left, for example, went to Southeast Asia from 11th, 12th century onwards, was that they were stepping outside civilization and were deserving of absolutely no protection from the imperial regime whatsoever. You know, they'd joined the barbarians. Whereas the Western tradition was completely different in terms of how the, crown and country protected and saw Western settlers. So I think that that there is a very big difference in the way that it's likely to be expressed. But I wouldn't underestimate either. I mean, we're now in a new, different global context. So China, in this world, will project itself not just in East Asia, but globally in various ways. It's got all sorts of interests that it needs. For example, most vividly over the last 10 years, and no doubt the next period as well, its need for commodities. I think it will seek to project its values, however that we might see those, or however it might see them, on a global basis. But I don't expect China, for example, to be a particularly military expansionist force. I would be quite surprised if it was. I think they probably learnt a lesson as well from the Soviet Union as well, what a disastrous approach that was.
I'm interested to hear you say that because I was at Annapolis recently at the US Naval Academy, and they regard China's submarine program and suspected aircraft carrier program as evidence of rather the opposite. But let me ask a second different question.
China still, extraordinary, has not got an aircraft carrier. I mean, even Italy's got an aircraft carrier.
Yes.
Sorry, I thought I'd bring you in.
Yes, we'll be doing When Italy Rules the World next week. Let me ask a second quite different question. It seems pretty much conventional. I don't think this is an original part of your book to say that the Confucian tradition, which has been in China for centuries, even millennia, is the real driver, and that any more recent cultural phenomena have been ephemeral, and that therefore China kind of reverts to its pre-1949 or even earlier cultural tradition. I just see why that's intuitively attractive because of the sheer time periods involved. On the other hand, there was never really quite the same effort to educate the masses in the Confucian tradition. It was an elite cultural tradition, as I understand it. Whereas first Western nationalism, and then even more importantly, that great import of Western civilization, Marxism, ended up being taught to the masses. I mean, particularly after 1949, there's a really sustained mass education program. It may not have lasted so long, but it surely reached many, many more people and went far beyond the elites. You seem to discount any cultural legacy of Mao and paint a picture in which China is really reverting to a pre-1949 tradition. Am I misrepresenting you there, or was that just a kind of shorthand in your discussion? Tell me what the enduring legacy of this communist period has been.
Yeah, I think you are slightly, but but that's because you read the earlier edition of the book. Because you did take me up on this, and I think it was a good criticism of what I was doing. I mean, I think that first of all you're wrong about Confucianism. It was a popular tradition, and actually, for example, during the Ming and the Qing, there was a real attempt to convey Confucian moral norms to the population. And I mean, I think that one of the real characteristics of Confucianism is the way that it's embedded in a profound way in the family and the family norms, and the way in which the whole, the family lies at the heart of the way China more widely is seen, the country is seen, and the role of the emperor and so on. So, I think that Confucianism is deeply embedded, much more embedded within society because of that than the communist tradition, which comes along much later. What is, but at the end of the day, the Confucian tradition, as expressed, failed because it failed to modernize China. I mean, Japan had the Meiji Restoration and got on with the job of modernizing and learning from the West. China had this long, traumatic, cathartic period when it nibbled away at the problem but didn't tackle it. And it ended in a long period of, the century of humiliation, the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the end of the imperial period, then the failure of the 1911 revolution in effect to change things, and then the warlord period and blah, 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 and occupation by Japan and so on. I mean, it's a complete, in Chinese terms, this was abject humiliation. I think historically what the important thing about the Mao period was that the agency of modernization in China was the communist tradition. And that was which was a Western tradition, as you rightly say. So, and what now actually I think Maoism, it's called Marxism, but really Mao indigenized it in such a way that it was very different from the Marxist tradition more widely. And so I think it's more correct actually to talk about probably Maoism or something like that than it is to talk about Marxism. But one of the consequences of this is that unlike the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Communist Party was never a popular force, it was based in the cities, it never had support in the peasantry and so on. So it was always in a way beleaguered, which was one of the reasons I think it was so authoritarian. The Chinese Communist Party was not like that. It was, the Kuomintang was strong in the cities. The Chinese Communist Party was based in the countryside. So it had much more popular roots. And this is why you could have the history it's had. Much more flexible, much more pragmatic, able to reinvent itself, etc. Now, the thing is that what Maoism did, I mean, you know, he blew away some of the worst aspects of the hierarchical and inegalitarian nature of the imperial Confucian tradition. For example, there was a big women were really subjugated in imperial China. And if you look at now, you can see extraordinary, actually, prominence of women, I think, in Chinese life, given it's still a relatively developing country. This is a legacy of the 1949 revolution. Likewise, land reform. So there were certain fundamental things that Mao did to change China, which created the possibilities of what's happened, especially since 1978. And so I think there's a direct line of continuity between what Mao did and what's happened since 1978, even though central planning, command economy, and all that's gone up in smoke. The other point I was going to make in this context was that I think that ultimately to succeed, the communist regime has had to align itself with a lot of Confucian values. I think the trick, historically, of the legitimacy, especially since 1978, of the communist regime has been its ability to articulate the Confucian tradition into the modern period. And I think that actually, I don't think this whole period could have succeeded if it had just been a rejectionist position on Confucianism, even though Mao, even himself, of course, was very anti-Confucian. But what was more Confucian than the Little Red Book? I mean, it was a real Confucian popular style.
Thanks, Martin. Well, now I'm going to invite you to raise hands and ask questions. Can I suggest that when you do so, you introduce yourself so that our guest knows who's asking the questions? Please.
Rich McKean, Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement. Why can't the Tibetans and the Uyghurs be given one country, two systems?
Well, it's a very good, a very pertinent question, and I think, I mean, of course they do. The way Tibet and Xinjiang work is very different from other provinces. So you could say that's already the case, but
the Uyghurs and the Tibetans perhaps would not say so.
Well, no, I'm saying no, they wouldn't. But I'm saying the way it actually is very distinct from. I mean, you know, it's very distinct because the system of governance is a hand-dominated governance which tries to incorporate an ethnic group, two ethnic groups which do not buy in to essentially to the way it works in these two systems at the moment. Both, well, especially the Tibetans, have a huge subsidy from central government, one of the probably the biggest subsidy of any province per capita, but it hasn't solved the problem. So why? I think the reason is because, you see, Hong Kong and Taiwan are Han Chinese. And Xinjiang and Tibet, obviously, are not. And so for China, the problem of these two provinces is about separatism, and they're seen as a real threat to the the unity of China. So they will not, the traditional way in which the Han, not just now, but over a long period, have handled this is by, by very authoritarian means. This is nothing new. This goes back a long time. What's going to happen, I don't know. I mean, historically, I would have said to you, if China carried on just like it is, always has done, then the Chinese will just eventually, the Han will get their way. And, there's only 10 million Uyghurs, there's less than 6 million Tibetans. They'll just ignore the problem. I mean, historically, that's what happened. I mean, Sichuan province was a much, much bigger problem, was restructured in a much more fundamental way by population resettlement, which is what's going on, as you know, in Xinjiang and Tibet. I'm not sure they can get away with it, though, because as China becomes a global power, one of the responsibilities and the price you have to pay for being a global power is, global attention. And it looks really bad for China in the developing world, especially, which they are extremely interested and concerned about, when, they can't, when clearly, the Han do not respect these ethnic minorities.
Regina Abrami, Harvard Business School. I have a question. I want to push you back a little bit on your vision of the Chinese state. You describe it as extraordinarily competent. And to me, it's extraordinarily incompetent. Particularly if I look at it today, I see increasing pollution, rising income inequality, increasing illiteracy, an inability to deal with diversity at the same time that they're trying to globalize. And when I look at where they've been successful, it's been in areas where they've allowed market forces to operate more freely. And let me give you a couple of examples. So one being local government officials, and when have they gotten local government officials to do the kind of work they've wanted when the incentive has been a very clear material incentive in terms of promotions. Raise GDP, you get promoted. If I look at how they've funded their infrastructure, I look at how they say, let's raise the funds for infrastructure and let's charge a premium, market-based premium for infrastructure so that we can maintain that infrastructure. Again, market forces. Where I see them fail, I see them doing things like arrangements where they pay in advance for commodities through some kind of swap arrangement, and then suddenly something like copper prices goes through the roof, and they've already, or the commodity prices drop, and they've already agreed to a price that has them paying top of the market rather than bottom of the market. So I want to pose a sort of a vision to you of a highly incompetent state that's trying to be the paternalistic vision you're giving, of trying to control everything. And yet when it tries to control things, it actually ends up with less control than it might utterly like. So if they're as wise as you say, the end result has to be that they must allow more market forces to come in. So for example, if they can't control governance of sort of state-owned corporations, they probably can't own 70% of the shares. They probably have to let more of those shares out in the public as a governance mechanism. If the Chinese state, and the Communist Party more bluntly, is going to let market forces ultimately do the governance for them, how stable is that state?
Well, I don't think that is a correct picture, actually, of what China's like. I mean, I think that, well, first of all, when you say, well, look at the environment, look at the corruption and so on, I mean, yeah, of course, it's true that China's an environmental mess and so on, in many respects. But, the problems you point to are also problems of an extremely large developing country. And I think corruption is definitely a very serious problem in China, but, corruption comes in many shapes and sizes across the world, including in the United States. I think that the problem of corruption is when it stops the system functioning well. That's when it becomes a real governance problem. And I'm not convinced that that stage has been reached in China. I'm not saying it won't be, but I don't think that the system does function with, in a rough and ready way pretty effectively. But where I disagree with you is about really so on the environmental question. Well, I mean, this is a very, if you're a poor country, and if you're a poor country and you've got very few resources apart from people, you use what resources you've got available. So the Chinese have used coal. The coal is filthy coal, with very bad emissions. Okay, but that's what a developing country does. I mean, I think that we need a sense of historical perspective when we're assessing a developing country as against a developed country. But it will not surprise me in the least if actually China doesn't seriously major on climate change and seek to set a good example as a global citizen. I would not be surprised that China presents a very ambiguous picture of dirty coal and a hard drive in areas like wind power and solar energy and so on. Because, you know, the Chinese are feeling the effects of climate change in their own territory more than anywhere else virtually, and also have always bought the science. They've never claimed that climate change is not true. But that's not really the point I want to make. The real point I want to make is that I think that, the rise in China and in the other Asian tigers, it is a mistake to think that these are simply market-driven transformations. I think this is a mistake, historical mistake. One of the reasons why the Asian tigers have been successful, not the only reason, and I'm talking about Taiwan, South Korea, and so on, is that the state has been an extremely important presence in conceiving the process by which economic takeoff could take place. But the difference between the Asian tigers and other countries that have often been very statist is that they've always understood the aim is to be competitive, is to be internationally successful in terms of exports, and that in that context the market is something to be used and not rather than planning. And but the actual process has been very state conceived and state designed, and that's true in all of those countries, but it's also certainly especially true in China. The state has played a really important role in terms of setting limits to market forces or allowing market forces in some industries to let rip in the most, in competition, terms of competition, which would, as good as happened in America in the late 19th century. And one of the interesting things I have to add to that is that, and I don't know what the consequences will be in the longer run, but it has to be noted that the Chinese state is much more present in the Chinese economy than is true in any of the East Asian tigers. So, for example, even, the big companies are still predominantly state-owned. The privatization that was introduced by Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin at the end of in the late 1990s didn't go nearly as far as it went in Russia. Thankfully, I think, for them. And many of the private firms, you've got a Lenovo, haven't you? You told me you've got a ThinkPad. Well, yeah? You've got a Lenovo.
Oh, Lenovo, yes.
Yeah.
I wish I didn't.
Yeah, I know you will get it. But, the main shareholder in it is the Chinese Academy of Science. So, it's a very Chinese state solution to the question of opening up. And I'm not convinced, I think that, at the end of the day, you'd have to say, well, over the last 30 years, China's grown at over 10% a year and has clearly, in all sorts of ways, been a remarkable transformation. It has been responsible on its own for over half the reduction in poverty in the world. Now, this is an extraordinary achievement, and the state has been extremely important to the process. And if you'd left it just to market forces, it wouldn't have happened.
The authentic voice of Marxism today. Yes, please.
Okay, my name is Mario Pini. I'm an Italian retired diplomat. I come from the small country with a career. And I am a visiting scholar at the Fairbanks Center. I listened very carefully and with great interest about your 4 characteristics, how China is different from the Western world. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that after the 4th, I've not been capable by myself of making a leap of understanding. Maybe I should read your book, but
That's the whole idea.
Yeah, I can't say everything, otherwise you won't buy it.
For less than $30, I think the book is 29 something. Could you give us just a little hint? Because the Chinese tributary system, we could imagine that in some new form, valuable for parts of Asia. But could you hint, you know, the chair kind of hinted that he's not 100% sure if Goldman Sachs 2050, that prediction will work. Can you hint us a little bit more about how the future world will look like? Of course, possibilities, because nobody has a crystal ball. Or I have to buy your book. I will buy it. I will buy it.
So what do you want? What are you asking me?
I would like to know how you imagine the future. Because
Okay, imagine the future. Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, just one point, because I think I was slightly unfair to you at the end, so I apologise for that. What I wanted to say is that I also think that just coming to a question, that the Chinese state tradition is very different from the Western state debate over markets versus state, and that the way the Chinese state has grown up in relationship to society is different. But that's another, maybe we can talk about it later.
Yeah.
I know you're not, but I think I wanted to add that dimension. What the point of what I was trying to say, just in case it was lost on others as well, is that I want, you know, my argument is not just the rise of China, but what the significance of the rise of China will be and how it will change the world. So the justification for, in the subtitle of the book, The End of the Western World, is not the demise of the West, of course not the demise of the West, but the world will be increasingly, will become progressively less shaped by the West and more shaped by, in this instance, China. So now, the thing is that the assumption hitherto has been, you know, that overwhelmingly, I think, about China. I mean, why? Can you explain to me why, if you go along to a bookshop, and the vast majority of bookshops on the shelves about China that aren't historical, etc., about contemporary China, are economic or business? There's been an extraordinary neglect of the question, which in a way is what my book is trying to address, is what will be not just the economic, but the political and cultural and intellectual consequences of the rise of China. How will that change the world? And so I am therefore very interested in the question of what will Chinese modernity be like? So these 4 characteristics, I've got 8 in the book, but you'll have to read the book to find out the other 4. You know, as soon as I think you start thinking of China in these terms, I mean, you may be persuaded by the points or half of them or not, but anyway, I think as soon as you start thinking of China in these terms, you can see that a Chinese-shaped world will be profoundly different in certain respects. Not completely different, but profoundly different in certain respects from a Western-shaped world, with drawing on the traditions of Western history and culture and so on. In the future, I think this is a long, you know, I think it's a long process, actually, that we're witnessing. I mean, even in terms of, those Goldman Sachs figures, if you look at the standard of living per head in the United States compared with China in 2050, the Chinese standard of living will be only a bit over half that of the United States. So it will still be a much less mature economy than the American economy in 40 years' time. And so I think this is a long and very complicated process. I mean, we've never witnessed a process like this. You know, this is completely novel. The Western world has always been shaped by dominant powers, which have both got very large economies and have got very high living standards. The rise of China and India is a completely new situation, where the largest economies will no longer be rich societies. and that I think is going to have quite all sorts of implications, which are difficult. All sorts of implications, difficult to think them through, but all sorts of implications. So I think it's quite a long-run process we're looking at. But maybe certain stages will be reached quite quickly. I mean, I think the global financial crisis is really about the inability of the United States any longer to underpin the international economic order that it founded and has been the chief patron of. And therefore, I think we're in for a long period of relative instability in that context. Now, and there's no successor state. There is an obvious successor state, but it's absolutely not ready for it, which is China. It doesn't want it. I mean, in that sense, it's a bit like the United States was in the interwar period. It didn't want to take over from Britain. And it only did so at the end, with Bretton Woods and so on at the end of the Second World War. But I do envisage, some things will happen quite quickly, which is over the next 10 years or so or maybe a bit longer, the dollar will lose its reserve currency status in the way that it's been. The RMB won't take over, but the RMB will become increasingly important, and we'll have an open capital account for the RMB. And the RMB is already, if you look at trade in East Asia, I was asking someone in the Chinese leadership about this the other week when I was in Beijing. I mean, what proportion of trade in East Asia is now conducted in the RMB rather than the dollar? And it's a significant development. And they're talking, for example, about now they're talking seriously about an Asian monetary fund in the region. If that happens, that will be really significant, because that will seriously weaken the role of the dollar in that region. And this has the assent of Japan as well. Japan is in favour of that. In fact, originally it was a Japanese idea during the course of the Asian financial crisis, 1997 to 1998. So, I discussed this in the book. There are many, many aspects to this. Really, so I do recommend this book that's just come out today.
You win.
I do? Okay, we'll buy a few copies then.
My name is Mangalam Srinivasan. I am a former fellow and a resident of Cambridge, Massachusetts. I first would like to ask you if there is a Sinophobia. If there is a lot of fear about China from many different quarters, Western, Eastern, and neighbors and so on. And I also would like to point out the fact that when Vietnam collapsed, Lee Kuan Yew wrote an article in the New York Times, and in which he said that the Western powers had no patience, which the Chinese were very ready. He didn't name the Chinese. He said the other supporters of Vietnam were ready to match. And China still is a very patient country. It's still studying the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is too quick to pass judgment on them. And you just now said Confucius still guides. I don't believe that Confucian thought is still the most prevalent, because the Chinese young people have much more in common with the young people across the globe than inside of China. And also, it is to say that Confucian was probably the first theorist, is really to once again exhibit a Western inability to comprehend the world history and makes it as disconnected as ever. The contemporary areas of other parts of Asia, there were thinkers far more profound than Confucian. Why that that people do not make it is because there are civilizations which are much more inward-looking. I have one more thing to say. In China's trouble in the future, particularly when China's beginning to import far more than it's going to export, that parity will be reached quite soon, that China has already given controls over to the outside area than within itself. There's going to be a considerable amount of internal problem within China, which no civilization. I do agree with you. It is, along with India, is the only two of the world's oldest civilizations that's living with its own criteria, with its own values, with its own streams of thinking. But despite that, I think that China's problem is much more internal than external.
Yeah, yeah. the first point you made was, is there a
fear of China?
A fear of China.
Are we not taking, shouldn't we be taking China far more on a debate basis than dialoguing with them?
Is there a sinophobia? I mean, obviously there is up to a point. I might be completely wrong about this, but my feeling is a certain almost equanimity about the rise of China. Actually, it's not a sort of it's nothing like the Cold War. It's not reached the scale of a kind of China scare, as happens has happened in the past about Chinese migration to the States and so on. So I think at the moment, I'm surprised. I mean, maybe it's just I'm looking at it more pessimistically than you, that there hasn't been more sort of fear of China's rise so far. But that, that might change. But maybe I'm just being too pessimistic, and therefore, as I don't see it, I think, makes me more equable about it.
Not to interrupt, but you never refer to human rights because it's the Chinese from inside who are contacting the outside.
Okay.
I myself get lots of emails.
Yeah.
But I just was wondering if...
Yeah. I mean, on your second point about patience, I think you're absolutely right about this. I think that the Chinese are very patient. They have a very, very different sense of time to the one that we're used to in the West, and especially the United States. In fact, they're opposite, very opposite conceptions of time. The Chinese think naturally long term. I mean, the apocryphal story about, Henry Kissinger asking Zhou Enlai, what do you think of the French Revolution? He said it's too early to say. And it's a nice story because I think it does capture a kind of civilization state way of thinking, which is that and a different sense of time, a different notion of time. And I'm very struck by the way the Chinese have conceived of, their rise. I mean, by and large, they are playing for time, I think. I mean, while they're growing like they are at the moment, actually every relationship that China's involved in is moving with time in a more favourable direction. So the relationship with Japan, well, if China continues to grow like it does for another 20 years, 10, 15 years, strong growth, it doesn't have to be at the present rates, but 6 to 8% or something like that, then Japan will be in a different relationship to China. And I think it does view its relationships likewise the relationship with the United States. And it's certainly been true in the region. So I think they are very patient, and they play a very long game. But I don't mean that in a kind of, I don't think that's just a kind of ploy. I think that's a cultural facet of the way the Chinese think. On your last, well, you made several points, but the other one I'll pick up on is internal problems. Yes, I agree with you. I think that if you ask me what is the greatest threat to the rise of China, it is internal. I mean, because, the great strength of China is this enormous civilization state, and the great weakness of China is also this great civilization state, because it is so difficult to hold together. It's a really complex and challenging problem. And basically China's greatest difficulties historically have been when they couldn't hold the country together properly. And we've just lived through a classic period of that. I mean, that was the century of humiliation and so on, when governance became ineffectual. If you ask me, well, what will go wrong in China? Well, I think problems like corruption, disparity in wealth and so on their own, I think they can be contained. But if they became all linked together, so governance became very difficult, then that would be a different situation. And someone asked me, actually, when I was in Shanghai, about talking about the book, and someone made an interesting point. He said, what do you think the effects of urbanization and so on will be on China, and do you think China will hold together? And I think that it is true that you know, with one of the problems of letting rip with economic growth in the way that's happened is that many of the disparities within China have grown very rapidly, and it could be, you know, the mentality of a city like Shanghai is very, very different. I mean, I hadn't been there for a few years, and I went back, and the real change in attitudes amongst the Shanghainese a bit like Hong Kong, slightly like Hong Kong used to be, quite arrogant actually, you know, based on this extremely buoyant and increasingly important financial centre, and that's going to strain the fabric of China and make the problems of governance, it seemed to me, maybe more complicated. Well, in some ways, definitely more complicated.
Now, we have about 10 minutes left, and I have 4, maybe no, 5 people who've raised their hands. I'm going to slightly break the order in order that we get at least one question from an East Asian. We've had Europeans, Americans, South Asian, but it would be, I think, strange not to have a question from at least one East Asian. So I'm going to go there, and then what I'd like you all to do, because I'm going to go round the remaining questioners, formulate the question as pithily as you can, and then we'll give Martin a chance to sum up.
My name is Ben Huang. I'm the second-year MPA student at Harvard Kennedy School. My question for you is, do you propose the rise of China also means the downfall of the United States? Historically, the downfall of British Empire and the rise of America was a very benign phenomenon where two countries were allied during the two wars. Now, do you perceive a possible, even a remote possibility of a military showdown between China and the United States over issues such as Taiwan or the territory disputes in the southern China Sea? If you were to advise President Obama, what would you tell him about his China strategy? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And then we'll go over here for the next question.
I hope you get that advice to President Obama soon. Since I'm Mark Elliott. I teach in the East Asian Languages and Civilizations department here. I have two challenges for you. I very much appreciate your bringing up to our attention a lot of the cultural issues here that, as you point out, are often lacking in discussion about China today. One is a challenge on a interpretation from outside, and the other has to do with the way you see the Chinese state today. On interstate relations in the so-called Chinese world order and the importance of the tributary system, I would submit that you grossly overestimate the stability of this system.
Of the tributary states?
Yes, and the degree to which this, in fact, governed Chinese foreign relations over the last, say, 1,000 years. As I'm sure you're aware, for most of the last 1,000 years, China has been governed by non-Han peoples. Yeah. And as far as there not being any competitors or challenges to the Chinese state, I think that both the Mongol and Manchu conquests are evidence that, in fact, there was quite serious competition for who was going to be running a China-based state, whether it would be the Chinese people themselves or other outsiders. And then in terms of the way that these 4 characteristics that you have raised for us, it seems to me, and perhaps you would agree, that there's a massive contradiction at the heart of the constitution of the modern Chinese state, which, as you point out, is ethnically totally dominated by the Han, 90% or so. So demographically, it looks very much like a nation state. Any nation state that can claim 90% of our population thinks of itself as one group, regardless of whether they really are or not, doesn't matter. That's pretty good. But the problem, of course, is that the territory of the country is not so homogeneous at all. And the earlier question about the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, at least 1/3 to 1/2 of Chinese territory is, in fact, governed nominally by means of different autonomous regions or prefectures or counties and so on. So it seems that in terms of trying to accommodate themselves to inheriting what was a multicultural empire, the present-day rulers of China face this problem of trying to reconcile a conception of the nation-state with the fact of an old civilization state. I'm not sure of the difference between civilization state and empire, but it seems to me that that's very much alive and is a problem that has yet to be dealt with completely. That was as pithy as I could be.
Even pithier, please.
Very pithy.
Even very pithy. The next two questions will have to be very pithy.
James Broding, Kennedy School, former managing director of Templeton Investments, and I think all of us, has completely defied even the most optimistic expectations. Just the magnitude and rapidity of this economic progress of China the last 20 years. But the bare argument, and there's not many left, I accept that, but the bare argument is that 60 to 70% of that growth has been driven by infrastructure spending, and at some point you just can't continue to build factories. There's a surfeit of product out there already. You can't continue to build streets and hospitals, etc. The manufacturing base of the United States and Europe has already been hollowed out. So what more industries can you take over? And you're sitting on this huge pile of U.S. Treasury bills, and at some point the U.S. is just going to capitulate and devalue the value of the dollar, and so the Chinese are going to get stuck with the whole mess. So I'm not saying I subscribe to that argument, but I just would like to know from you, sort of in economic terms, how is this really going to play out? Is there really going to be sort of a sustainable consumer society which actually also buys our products instead of just supplying them?
And one last question, but as short as possible.
I'm Ghanshyam Tiwari. I'm at Kennedy School, first year MPA student. My question is that with the influx of global capital, what new power structures or power groups that you expect to emerge in China, and do you think that these new power groups will have a potential to destabilize the state of China? For example, several people becoming super rich and conspiring against the state, or some order like that.
Chinese oligarchs. Martin, you've got 5 minutes to answer these 4 questions. Off you go.
No problem. Right, okay. Does the rise of China mean the decline of the United States? Yes, it does, in terms of global power.
That's one down.
Hey, shall I do them all like that? Yeah, it does. But you pointed to the classic example of a case where the shift in power did not have disastrous consequences, which was Britain and the United States. Now, it's true other things were going on, and it's also true that there was a particular relationship between Britain and America, which I think helped, a certain shared historical and cultural and ethnic legacy, which continues to this day in certain respects. Will it happen with the United States and China? I worry about it. I do. I don't think it'll end in a military show. Well, if it's a military showdown, it will be the last ever, won't it? So one has to hope to hell that it's not it doesn't end in a military showdown. Will it lead to? I think it will lead to new conflicts and tensions between the United States and China. If you take the last 10 years and the way China's moved into Africa, Latin America, East Asia in new kinds of ways and so on, the areas for conflict between the United States and China are growing apace all the time. But so far they've been, they've been the subject of a lot of cooperation and discussion, and the environmental question has moved into this area as well. There's high-level discussions between China and the United States about it. So, my element of encouragement about what's going to happen is that if you take American-Chinese relations over since the Mao-Nixon rapprochement, actually the remarkable thing is how stable the relationship has been between them, not how unstable the relationship has been. Now, it could go off the rails. It could go off the rails, but that will be my source of encouragement. But it won't necessarily stay like that. My greatest worry is not actually China in this context. I think the earlier point about China's patience is important here. What worries me is the reaction in the United States. America's not ready, not prepared for this decline. It's not thought about it. It's not discussed it. It's not really debated it. It's been at the edges. And now it's happening. How in particular the American right respond to it. So I don't know. So I'll make those points. I'm not going to advise President Obama because it's too late. I can't get the message through in time. On the question of your very interesting points, yeah, these need more than 1 minute to reply to. Overestimate the stability of the. Okay, well we'll talk. We perhaps have a chat about that. Yeah. I mean, I like the way you look at the question of the Chinese ethnicity and pointing out the importance of the Qing was Manchu and the Yuan was Mongolian, and this is also part of the picture. And I think that has to be. I didn't talk about it. You're absolutely right, and it is another aspect to look at it, and I think that looking at the way in which you presented a certain also conflict or discordant relationship between civilization state and nation state in the Chinese context is also an interesting point. So I respond positivly to your point. So there's one other thing I wanted to say. No,
You don't have time.
I don't have time. Okay, he's state power. State power. I can't do anything.
You've got to address the bear case.
What was the bear case?
Should we worry about the Chinese economy coming unstuck?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. No, I like. Why should I add to that? It was a great scenario. I don't think I can.
Is it realistic what I said?
No. It was. Well, I think that that China will be obliged. It will be obliged to shift its economic priorities, and I mean, it's been a very intensive period of economic growth in the early stages of economic takeover, early, mid, and middle stages of economic takeover. So half the population is still in the countryside. But as it's reaching this point, already it's faced with problems. It can't keep relying on huge levels of investment to power its economic growth. Your point about infrastructure and so on. So it's got to raise productivity. Its economic productivity in various areas. It can't rely on exports in the way that it's been relying on export. It has to develop consumption. To develop internal consumption, it's got to do some other things. It's got to offer, in particular, public goods. public goods like the health and so on. So, and I think we'll see that. And if you look at the leading Chinese economists like Yu Yongding and so on, they've been saying this for several years now, and it's beginning to happen. I mean, things are changing.
I wonder if we have time, we probably don't, to address the new
power groups.
Of whether new power groups will challenge the Chinese state. If there were time, I'd love to hear your answer to that.
But can I just say one thing?
It's going to have to be short.
Yeah, one of the interesting things in Hong Kong is the way in which the same pattern of relationships are reproduced in Hong Kong as in the mainland, which is the oligarchs have been incorporated into the state mechanism, and it's a classic Chinese solution.
Martin, you've done a brilliant job of answering some very difficult and wide-ranging questions. You've given us a wonderful perspective on China's rise. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. You're so generous.
Pass the book to me.
Are you good?
Martin Jacques is a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics Ideas. He's also a columnist for The Guardian and The New Statesman. For more information, visit martinjakes.com.